The 6th of June 1944, D-Day, the storming of the Normandy beaches. But I want to know, did Australia on the other side of the world have any real connection to this operation? If you enjoy the video and you find it interesting, then please do like and subscribe.
Australia doesn't have a huge connection with D-Day, does it?
Well, it's got more of a connection than many people would realise. Of course, it was happening an entire world away, and the Australian focus was then and has always been
Japan.
Very much on the campaign against the Japanese, closer to home. But I think there are two reasons, and certainly historians would say there are two reasons why Australia has quite a connection to D-Day and why we should be taking an interest. And they are, firstly, that a lot of Australians did serve, not only on the day itself, but in the campaign to clear the Germans from France afterwards. And also that, of course, if D-Day had failed, which it could have, the Allied commanders secretly feared that it might, Australia would have been pretty isolated. The Brits and the Americans would have been in serious trouble. They couldn't have just gone back the next year. And Australia would have been one of the very few liberal democracies in the world left standing.
Yes, that's something to think about.
It really is.
Obviously, we came close. In terms of the numbers, how many Australians were involved?
Well, on the day itself, it's been estimated that there were 3,300. But like any historical statistics, there's so much fluidity. Those are known men and women serving.
If I was being honest, I would have said 0. I wouldn't have assumed that there would have been any Aussies in Normandy on those beaches on D-Day. No way. So to even think there was that many is amazing.
What we don't know, for example, is how many Australians had enlisted in the British Army whilst over there. Many did. Or how many Brits or Poles or Canadians later came out to Australia after the war and became Australians. But 3,300 is a pretty good solid number.
Yeah, and then what was the total force?
Well, about 150,000 men hit the beaches, landed. Then there were 20 to 30,000 paratroopers and glider troops who'd gone in the night before to secure bridges and so forth. The air and naval power was just phenomenal. There was something like 5,300 ships involved. And this doesn't include some of the ferries. This is just military hardware. And then about 8,000 fighters and bombers.
I never knew any of those statistics about D-Day. Wow. I didn't realise the actual sheer number of force that was involved, because the most of my learning has come from games like Call of Duty, incredible recreation of it, or Saving Private Ryan. That's been in my memory. Those two have really created my picture of what happened on D-Day. I didn't even know there was that sort of figures and those numbers of ships and people.
8,000 fighters and bombers.
Yeah.
Wow.
These numbers are just extraordinary.
They're almost hard to compute, aren't they?
They are. I mean,
Definitely.
I thought I'd read about this a fair bit, but you've shocked me with some of these numbers.
Well, it was the greatest invasion fleet the world has ever seen, and hopefully ever will again.
Yeah. One would hope there wouldn't be too many more necessary. And how many did we actually lose right on the beaches?
On the day itself, Australia lost 13 men. Now, they were 11 aircrew and 2 naval personnel, because that's where most Australians were serving in the air. The majority in the air, about 500 attached to Royal Navy vessels and a handful in the ground forces. 500
attached to Royal Navy vessels.
That's right.
Yeah, it's amazing how we managed to do that in those days.
Well, I mean, the connection was so strong.
And was it so strong that they virtually commanded Australia or not?
Yes and no. Australians, of course, served independently, but they were part of a greater Commonwealth war effort. So when asked to go places, they would.
And what about heroism? Now, heroism is sort of an easy word to use, but it wouldn't have been easy on those beaches.
Of course not. And you're right, heroism is a word that we perhaps sometimes overuse, but you can't overuse it when you're talking about the events of D-Day. And the stories just stand out. They stack up. I could talk about them for hours, but I won't go overboard. One that stands out is, well, just because of the connection with our Anzac story, is a man, George Dixon, who was one of the first Anzacs ashore at Gallipoli in 1915. He was underage, he'd enlisted, he'd lied about his age, and he lasted a week there.
Did, didn't they?
Oh, why?
That's so true, especially in World War One. The amount of stories you hear about young boys signing up under the age because they wanted to. I don't know if it was the patriotism, if it was the excitement maybe of doing something new and visiting places you'd never have been before. But why would these young children want to sign up to it? It's crazy to think of it now anyway. Back then it probably seemed normal, but now, no way.
I'd lie about mine to get out of it.
Yeah.
He was wounded at Gallipoli, but then, being of his time, he enlisted again when war broke out, this time in the Navy, and at D-Day he was back commanding a landing craft, which he'd done a year earlier during the Allied invasions of Sicily, and had been decorated for his courage.
Wow. So we didn't have that many, obviously, though. This wasn't an Australian operation. What about in the air? Now, I know that we had a lot of cooperation in the air, didn't we?
Masses.
Yeah.
We had fighters, we had bomber crew, and we had lots more personnel on the ground. And again, there were Royal Australian Air Force squadrons serving, and then there were other Australians, even more actually, attached to British units. And some of the stories from the aircrew are phenomenal, such as one man I was reading about earlier today, George Martin. He was a Typhoon pilot, and this was in the days just after D-Day. He'd been attacking German planes, and he knocked one out, and then he went in for another run, and he got hit by ground fire. And his plane crashed, but he bailed out. He was behind German lines, and they weren't taking kindly to Allied aircrew, as you can imagine. He ended up posing as a deaf-mute injured Frenchman his helpers said he'd been injured by Allied bombers, and he managed to sort of get close enough to the Allied lines to sneak across.
Wow.
Yeah.
That would have taken some courage in itself.
Phenomenal, but better than being caught by the Germans, I'd imagine.
Yeah, well, how bad were they, the Germans, on that sort of thing? There was no sort of honour about prisoners of war, and that's...
Sorry, is he asking how were the Germans in regards to this? Is that even a question you need to ask? If you know what atrocities the Germans, the Nazis, did to people, just look at the Poles, look at the Jews, look at the blacks, look at the gays. What do you think they were going to do to an Allied soldier? That's a silly question. A silly question.
Sort of thing.
There was...
Or did it depend whether you were caught by the SS or
exactly.
a German army?
Exactly. And, I mean, some of the German army over there, as you probably know, weren't even Germans. Hitler and his general Rommel had built this massive fortification line along the Atlantic coast, which they boldly called the Atlantic Wall. And in parts, it was amazing. Bunkers and strong points. In other parts, it was ditches and sandbags. But a lot of the men who were serving there were conscripts from Poland, Ukraine. There are stories of British, Canadian and American troops storming up the beaches, after fighting their way up. It wasn't easy at all. And these guys coming out and surrendering and not understanding German when we brought the interpreters up because they were from Eastern
Europe. Because they weren't
German. And, there were other stories of some of these guys who were so desperate to surrender to the Allies that they would shoot their own German officers.
What about a fellow called Richard Pearce?
Richard Peary.
Sorry, yeah.
Easy. He was a Victorian guy. He'd actually played football for Hawthorn. And he joined the Navy as well. Like Dixon, who we mentioned before, who's a much younger man, of course, he was at the operations in Sicily. And on D-Day, his landing craft was in one of the first waves, disgorging Canadian troops on the beach. And the counterfire there from the Germans was extraordinary. And Peary's craft was hit. He was blown overboard and his body was never recovered. But he was mentioned in dispatches afterwards for his bravery. an extraordinary thing.
Can I ask you a question?
Of course.
Just interrupt you. Mentioned in dispatches is something you hear a lot, and it obviously means you did something good. How do you get to be mentioned in dispatches? What's the qualification?
Well, it's often when an officer will commend you for what you did. And of course, it doesn't have to be posthumous. In fact, you'd hope it wasn't. But it's basically what you might get if you don't get a medal. It's an honourable mention. And I mean that very sincerely, a very honourable mention. You've got to be good or do something good to be mentioned in dispatches. You've stood out on a day when everyone is standing out.
Yeah, well, I wonder how many of them there are.
It's a good question. I'll look it up tomorrow.
Yeah, do that, because I'm just fascinated by that.
Isn't this amazing? Already, and I'm sure there's going to be more. Already, there are so many different individual stories, especially of different people from Australia that were at D-Day. And it wasn't loads. They said, just over 3,000 were involved from Australia. Maybe more, maybe, people that were in England and yeah. But even then, there is still that connection that, for starters, I never knew existed. And even by the guy, the presenter here, he didn't really know either. And I'm just thinking, over in Australia, how much does Australia remember D-Day? Do you have it as, a minute's silence or anything like that? And how much of a big thing is it for you? I know you have Anzac Day, I know you have Remembrance Day, but obviously over here we have D-Day, which is it's a strong remembrance event.
And I think I'm getting in my ear another story about a Sherrington or a Shervington.
Olive Sherrington. Now this is probably my favourite story, so I should have started with it. I dropped the lead, sorry. Because this story's new. The historians at the Australian War Memorial, in particular Dr. Lachlan Grant, who I was chatting to just yesterday, are only just discovering Olive's story at the moment. She has a World War I connection, which I love. She was a British woman who was serving as a British Army nurse in World War I. She married an Anzac, a digger, who was stationed over there, and came back to Australia after the war. She lived in Sydney, and fast forward 2 decades, and she's now a widow. And she's gone over to Europe on a holiday, and the Second World War breaks out.
Oh,
so Olive, who's a pretty staunch individual, says, right, I'm going to do my bit again. And she joins a new unit called the Mechanised Transport Corps, or the Women's Mechanised Transport Corps. Now, this was a unit of women, as the name suggests, who would act as military drivers. They would drive trucks, ambulances, visiting dignitaries who couldn't speak English, all sorts. And at the start of the war, Olive served in France when we all know about the Blitzkrieg, the Blitz rather, and the Germans pushing the French and the British back to Dunkirk and a couple of other ports where they were evacuated from. Olive, actually, she was so brave, she missed the evacuation at Dunkirk. She had a truck full of wounded men, and the Germans had already cut off the approaches to Dunkirk. So she beetles across to Bordeaux with the advancing Germans hot behind her and gets onto a destroyer, is the last woman evacuated amongst the Allies, goes back to Britain, spends several years working as an ambulance driver during the Blitz of London, so she saw some horrific stuff. Then she's pretty much one of the first women back on French soil, landing in the days after D-Day.
That takes some guts.
Oh, it really does. And she then saw more. She was at the liberation of Belsen concentration camp, which just, yeah.
Wow. What a woman. What an incredible woman. And there are people like this. Some of the awful things that took place during World War I, World War II, and people just got on with things. That's the main thing I can say. People got on with things. And you certainly don't get that now. And I wouldn't. I would never join the army. I've got no interest in fighting. But back then, it's just something people did. It's almost something that people didn't think about. They just did it.
Yeah, I've read stories about people who discovered that because no one had seen anything the like of that before.
No, they really...
And they hadn't imagined it either. It
That's right.
Just wasn't in anyone's consciousness, was it?
That's right. Absolutely sickening stuff. And it's funny, as the funny, not funny at all. It's very interesting that as the campaign went on in the days and weeks and months after D-Day, because let's remember, you know, it was 10 months from D-Day until Germany surrendered, and then Japan went on fighting for another 3 months.
Oh, wow, I didn't know that.
The Allies, as they advanced across Europe and into Germany, found or were faced with some horrific things, and not just the concentration camps. And again, Australians were involved. This was when Hitler was unleashing his horrific V1 and V2 flying bombs. And an Australian pilot, actually, Kenneth Collier, was the first pilot to work out that you can knock these things out by flying alongside them and flipping their wings with your fighter wings. That takes guts.
That takes some... Well,
Wow.
I don't think I could even contemplate that. That's...
He'd run out of ammo, you see, and he knew that this thing was winging its way towards Britain and was going to cause some serious damage. So,
Ow! Oh my God. That is another story I've never heard. I'm so glad. I was thinking before I watched this, I'm thinking, how much am I going to learn from this? This is brilliant. I hope people are actually sticking around and listening to and watching this. The V1 and V2 rockets flying over, the plane ran out of bullets, so he nudged his wings up just to distort it out of line. Wow.
so he decided, right, I'm going to try this, and it worked.
And there was a fighter pilot, was it Donald Mason
Donald Mason, he was another one killed in the days after D-Day. I mean, so many. The Royal Australian Air Force, its worst month in its existence for casualties was June 1944. That just shows how many were involved. And there were actually more Aussies flying with the RAF. So it's a phenomenal number that got killed or wounded. One squadron, all 57 fighter pilots in this squadron were rotated between the beginning of June and the end of August. That means they were either all killed or wounded and new bloods brought in. But Mason, he was another Typhoon pilot. Now, Typhoons were kind of fighter bombers. They fired rockets and were great for knocking out tanks and smaller enemy strongpoints. They were on a mission against...
Weren't they also quite vulnerable to attack?
They could be. Well, certainly if a fast German fighter came out.
I mean,
yeah. But this guy was flying against flak positions near Caen in Normandy, and his plane was hit. I'm not sure whether it was ground fire or whether it was air attack. I think it was probably ground fire because by this stage the Germans had very few fighters left. And his Typhoon went down and embedded itself in a riverbank. And locals saw it go down, but for one reason and another, in the chaos of war, nothing happened until the early 90s when it was found and Donald Mason was taken out of the cockpit and buried with full military honours in the Norman cemetery.
Yeah, how many stories are there like that? I mean,
so many. And this was a man who'd flown more than 100 sorties, and you know, it's a lottery war, and eventually, if you're unlucky, your number's up.
Yeah, it is the wrong kind of lottery, but if you kept flying, and I've actually met some people who survived, who went on lots and lots of these missions, but they saw so many colleagues die.
Absolutely. Then, of course, in the Navy, that was equally dangerous, because you might think you're on these huge destroyers and you're pretty invulnerable, but the Germans had massive shore-to-ship batteries. One of the bravest Australians, though, who was involved in the naval operations was a guy who commanded midget submarines. Now, his name was Hudspeth, Kenneth Hudspeth. He had joined the Royal Navy and was put in command of one of these new midget submarines quite early in the war. They took 4 people, and he'd been involved in operations against German battleships and so forth. But before D-Day, again, we've discussed what a massive operation it was. It involved years of planning and months of intelligence and counter-espionage, and there are great James Bond-like stories of the things that went on. But Hudspeth's job was to take his midget sub over to the beaches that they'd earmarked as the landing beaches and land commandos, people who go ashore, maybe collect sand samples to check the density was right, recce German positions, and then scoot back across the channel. the day before D-Day, actually 2 days before D-Day, he was back again. And this time, on the 4th of June, his sub had to go offshore off one of the British beaches, Gold or Sword, and lurk at the bottom of the sea for 48 hours, because D-Day was originally going to be on the 5th, but it was postponed because of weather. So they ended up staying on the bottom of the sea for 48 hours until the invasion fleet finally came. And then they had to pop up, set off marker flares, and guide the fleet in.
2 days in a sub like that,
He would have smelt.
He would have smelt. Brilliant. Oh, just fantastic. Let me see how this finishes.
Oh, really horrible.
Well, they had to surface every 4 hours to put the periscope up for oxygen. And, that was so risky because, as anyone who's seen a film like The Longest Day or Saving Private Ryan knows, the Germans had these shore defences. They were on constant lookout. And, a periscope does stick out like a sore periscope when it pops out of the water.
Amazing, just amazing stories. Who would have known actually the connections that Australia had with D-Day? And I hope Australians remember D-Day just like we do in Europe, because you are a part of it too. Just incredible. You learn something. When you watch videos like this, you really learn something every time about individual stories, group stories, and things that, like I said at the start, I didn't actually have a clue the sort of numbers that stormed those beaches and attacked, Normandy. That is staggering to think, because I can't comprehend it in my head. I can't visualize all those ships and aircrafts and people. I just can't picture it. I really can't. And it's incredible. I hope you've enjoyed this. It's something I wasn't sure about, but it was so interesting learning about those people's stories and what they did. It's so brave. And they probably didn't even realize it was brave at the time, but incredible. Thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe. It really, really helps me out. And I'll catch you next time.